On October 12, 1972, a small chartered plane took off from Uruguay. This plane was bound for Santiago, Chile's capital, carrying tall, broad rugby players. Some of the players' families and friends joined the 45 travelers. A short flight was expected. Uruguay to Santiago takes 3 hours usually. The massive Andes Mountains appear along the road. World's longest mountain range is South America's Andes. Other than the Himalayas, these are the highest mountains. The passengers in our story are devastated by these gorgeous landscapes. On October 12th, a mountain storm hit, which prevented the plane from flying. The pilots stopped midway and tried again the next day. The airliner spent the night in Mendoza, Argentina. The next day, October 13th, the plane took off at 2:18 p.m. Pilots ensured weather clarity. For the following hour, the flight went smoothly. Pilots lowered the plane at 3:21 p.m. The plane was near Santiago but in the mountains. Since towering mountains border the city, turbulence erupted as they descended. The plane shook horizontally. Around this moment, clouds surrounded the plane. Clouds were all that was apparent. Plane sirens and warning lights flashed suddenly. No one understood why. The passenger rugby players were unfazed. This volatility didn't concern them. A traveler looked out the window and observed clouds clearing amid jokes. But then he saw they were dangerously near to a peak. As soon as the plane left the clouds, the pilots saw a large rock ahead. People panic and try to lift the plane. The plane's ground collision warning blared. A pilot gives maximum power to achieve altitude, to safely fly over the mountain. Unfortunately, it was too late. While climbing, the airplane hit the mountain in the rear. The plane split at the rear. 2 rows of back seats really flew out of the plane. 3 passengers disappeared with it by plane. After a few seconds, the plane fell. A few seconds later, another collision. The plane's left wing snapped. More passengers fell off the airliner. Now only the front of the plane remained, falling into a glacier. It fell after 700 meters after sliding down the glacier at 350 kilometers per hour. All plane contents were destroyed. Plane base and passenger seats were torn apart. The pilots died instantly when the plane's cockpit was crushed. This plane crashed at 3,570 meters on an undisclosed Andean mountain. Amazingly, 33 of 45 passengers survived. Somehow, they survived the crash. Because many were injured, no one knew where they were stuck. Further investigation revealed that this plane was 80 kilometers off course. Friends, this hard survival saga had just begun. No one could have predicted what happened to these survivors next, nor can you. The tragic tale of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. Find out in today's video. A plane crashed in the Andes. 45 people boarded, left for dead. Many are fascinated by survival. All passengers were declared deceased. It became the Andes miracle. 2 uninjured people survived this crash. They are 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino. As medical students, they promptly checked for survivors and treated the injured. They noticed many passengers were severely injured. A head fracture put 23-year-old Fernando Paradu in a coma. After the plane disappeared, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was notified within an hour. 4 planes searched for survivors. From sunset until night, they searched for the crash site but found nothing. The rescue service officials inferred from the radio communications that the aircraft landed in a remote and inaccessible place. Since the plane was white, it crashed on white snow and ice. It was hard to find amid the cold highlands. Late on October 13th, the surviving passengers were hopeful. They hoped that if they spent the night there and escaped the cold, someone would find them the next day. 5 injured passengers died that icy night. The surviving dropped from 33 to 28. The survivors sheltered in the plane's wreckage. They kept warm by closing the plane's rear with luggage, seats, and snow. Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay sent 11 planes to hunt the following day, October 14th. They chose the right search area. The crash site was in that search area. They couldn't find the crash site. Survivors tried to write SOS on the plane's roof using lipstick. Soon, they ran out of lipstick to write all the SOS letters. They tried to build a large cross in the snow with bags so search planes could see them. It soon became apparent that this was ineffective. 3 planes flew over them that day. They screamed, waved their hands, and tried to attract the airplane, but failed. This endeavor lasted another day. On October 15th, the survivors recognized they needed water to survive. Water was obtained by passenger Fito Strauch. He utilized a metal sheet to focus sunlight to melt snow. Water droplets were gathered in empty wine bottles. In addition, many passengers used the seat cushions as snowshoes and the wool in the seat covers as insulation. 3 days after the crash, Fernando Paradu awoke from his coma on October 16th. After waking up, he realized that his mother had died and his 19-year-old sister was gravely hurt. Paradu fed and watered his sister to save her. 8 days after the crash, his sister died. Accidents like these show how unpredictable life is. The majority of passengers were coastal. Never before had they seen snow. They were surviving at -30 degrees Celsius, at high altitude, without food or water. Another issue arose under these terrible settings: snow blindness. UV radiation from the sun reflecting on mountain snow and ice can damage your eyes. The term is snow blindness. 3 sunglasses were all these survivors had. 8 days after the disaster, search and rescue teams gave up on October 21st. They thought it was pointless to keep searching after 8 days of finding no survivors. After so many days, few could have lived. After 142 hours, the search was called off. The survivors found a transistor radio in the plane's seats. Roy Harley, a rugby survivor, loved electronics. He tried to turn on the radio. He improvised a long antenna. Eventually, his efforts fixed the radio. This radio communicated one way. The survivors could hear but not communicate. They heard the hunt was cancelled 11 days after the crash when they switched on the radio. They were heartbroken. People cry after hearing this news. Some clasped their hands and prayed. Fernando Paradu was the only one who didn't react greatly to this news, because he had another plan. After 11 days, survivors ran out of food. They started with little. Only 8 chocolate bars, 1 mussel tin, 3 little jam jars, and almonds were left. A box of peanuts, dates, candy, dried plums, and wine. Food restrictions began days after the catastrophe. They ate little daily. Paradu ate chocolate-covered peanuts for 3 days. Just 1 peanut. Rationing was insufficient, since the food was practically gone. At 3,800 meters, there were no trees, plants, or animals to kill and eat. Some tried to eat plain components on the 11th day because the food was gone. They tried eating the seat fabric and leather. This made them sicker. You'll be surprised what these survivors did when they had to starve. They ate their friends' and families' D***ad bodies to survive. It was a tough choice, because majority of the crash victims were friends, classmates, family, or relatives. We have to eat. And the only probable things were the dead bodies of the people in this plane. Canessa made the first attempt at this idea. Others tried but failed. Then they refused. They ultimately ate human meat 2 days later, out of need. This food source was diminishing rapidly for survivors on October 29th, 16 days after the crash. They had no strategy. Nobody knew what to do next. Nothing could have been worse. Later that night, they heard a loud growl, apparently an avalanche. Snow from the mountain top fell quickly, filling the fractured plane. 8 snowbound persons suffocated. Only 19 survived. This is it, Ted, Roberto. You'll perish. A very good feeling of heat between my legs because I peed on myself and said that's it. The remaining 19 passengers were also stuck under the snow. Paradu made a snow hole with a metal pole for ventilation. After 2 days of intense work, they built a tunnel under the snow and emerged with difficulty. After leaving, they observed a snowstorm coming and decided to return to the snow cave to survive. The survivors survived the confined confines for 3 days. They returned to the surface 3 days later in clear weather. After emerging, the survivors realized no one would save them. They must work to survive. Waiting for aid at the crash site was pointless. They must strive until the last breath. Strong survivors included Canessa, Paradu, and Vizintin. They agreed to give them additional food and warm clothes and let them walk around seeking help. The initial step was location estimation. The co-pilot said they passed Curacao before the crash. They estimated that walking a few kilometers west would take them to rural Chile, but their estimate was horribly off. Actually, the co-pilot didn't know where he was flying. Their accident site was 89 kilometers east in the Andes. Without knowing this, they rested for a few days to refuel. 3 persons sought rescue 33 days after the collision on November 15. They found their aircraft's rear after hours of eastward navigation. That portion of the plane broke first. Many suitcases, boxes of chocolates, 3 pork patties, a bottle of rum, additional clothes, comic books, and medicines were inside. They also found the aircraft's 2-way radio, a radio that can receive and broadcast messages. They stayed overnight. The next day, they head east, but after discussing it, they decide to try to turn on the aircraft's radio. They removed some batteries from the aircraft's main body and tried to ignite the radio. They may call SOS. The tail part had 24-kilogram batteries, but it was heavy. It could not be returned to the main body crash site, so they tried to switch it on immediately. They returned and enlisted Roy Harley, an electrical expert, but it failed. The airplane has a 24V DC battery and a 115V AC electrical system. They couldn't link them. After several days of trying, they discovered there was no other way to start the radio. They had to walk west to survive. On December 11th, 59 days after the disaster, an avalanche hit. It killed 3 more survivors. I was trapped completely by the storm, the avalanche. It was the most deadly silence that you may imagine. I couldn't move. 16 remained. They needed a nighttime sleeping arrangement to ascend Western highlands. How could they endure minus 30 degrees Celsius nights? One survivor was 18-year-old Carlos Miguel Rodriguez. He recalls learning needle sewing from his mother. He carried needles and a sewing equipment. He proposed stitching clothes into a large sleeping bag. I had the idea that with the insulation, you can make a sleeping bag. But I not only had the idea, I made it myself. They accomplished it. 2 months have gone since this incident. By December 12, Paradu, Canessa, and Vizintin bravely climbed the glacier without mountaineering gear. The only certain thing was to the west was Chile. Going west meant climbing MT. They thought they were only a few kilometers away. They thought walking for 2 to 3 days might help. So they brought 3 days of beef. To be warm, Paradu wore 3 pairs of jeans. He wore 4 socks and 3 sweaters over his t-shirt. His socks were covered by a plastic shopping bag. The cold was awful. Their technical gear, map, compass, and climbing experience were lacking. At this altitude, the air is thin and oxygen deficient. Despite that, they continued toward the summit. Their sewn sleeping sack was beneficial at night. They slowly moved forward during the day. The 3 of them slept close together in one sleeping bag. They started walking at sunrise. Together, they progressed gradually. On the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th days, they learned their estimate was completely inaccurate. They saw no end to their journey ahead. Based on their lack of food, Vizintin returned to the crash scene and only the other 2 continued. On December 15th, Vizintin returned downhill, making it easier. Within an hour, he reached the crash site using an aircraft seat as a sleigh. He returned to the crash scene in an hour after 3 days of climbing this mountain. Paradu and Canessa continued rising. After 3 hours, they reached the mountain's crest and saw only mountains for miles. Snowy mountains were all there was. Paradu struggled to find something else to view. 2 snow-free mountains appeared on the western horizon. They thought they should keep going that way. They persisted. Paradu and Canessa hiked for days. Last, they reached a valley with a river. Reaching the water was a relief. Because it was easy to discover a descending way downstream the river, they kept walking. Finally, on December 20th, they saw humanity after 9 days of hiking. They saw cows in fields. They were exhausted and couldn't move further. From across the river, look, a man on a horse. They observed 3 men on horses, trying to shout, Paradu, but the water was too loud for them to hear him. However, one saw Paradu and Canessa by chance, looked at them and shouted. He promised to return tomorrow. The next day, the man returns on horseback with paper and pencils. He threaded the paper and pencil to a stone and flung it across the river. Paradu could now communicate with the world. Parado wrote in Spanish, I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. He was from Uruguay. We walked for 10 days. Also, his injured buddies were at the crash site. He wrote that they required urgent support but didn't know how. Without food, their weakness, they couldn't walk anymore. He begged for salvation, asking where they were. However, Chilean farmer Sergio Catalan received this message. He read this note and gestured to show he understood. He learned from his 2 friends that they remembered faintly. A plane disaster was reported a few months before. They were surprised when these buddies learned this. They were shocked to find survivors of a 2-month-old plane disaster. Sergio threw bread across the river and galloped west on a horse for 10 hours. They remained far from any settlement. After reaching the nearest city, he informed the army command and called Santiago. Using horses, farmers delivered Paradu and Canessa to Los Maitines, where they eventually rest. Over 10 days, they walked 61 miles on wheel. He had lost half his weight. That time, he weighed 44 kilograms. Their story gained international news after others heard it. This heartbreaking tale was unbelievable. The Chilean Air Force rescues survivors promptly with 3 helicopters. Army officers interviewed Paradu and Canessa for location information. Paradu mapped their hiking routes using the pilot's flying chart. Army officers took him on a helicopter to find the crash scene. The army commanders found the survivors thanks to Paradu. 2 search and rescue helicopters saved survivors 70 days after the disaster on December 22nd. 1972. Rescued were 16 survivors. Their situation was horrible. Dehydration, altitude sickness, shattered bones, starvation. They all recovered. This story is a lesson to the world about hope. If you have decided to do something and you have patience and humanity, then nothing is impossible. If you want, you can achieve things that you can never even dream of. Thanks for watching.